The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to the New Norm. So you might not know this, but October is Pastor's Appreciation Month. So if you have not already reached out to your pastor to show him or her love, honor, gratitude, and appreciation, you've still got a couple days left to do that. Being a pastor has always come with its unique challenges. I've been a couple different kinds of local church pastors. I was a youth pastor. I was a discipleship pastor. I was a campus pastor. I was a church planting pastor. So I've had a chance to see this from a couple different angles. And while I'm not overseeing a local church now, I am convinced that being a pastor in these days, in the fall of 2025, seems harder than it has likely been in any other point in my lifespan. So there's just so much that goes into the mix of local church leaderships in a climate that is as culturally and politically divided as ours is. And then you add in ministry that is taking a trend towards the digital, and things just get increasingly complicated. With all that in mind, I just want to give you a snapshot of what kind of pastor the Apostle Paul says is worth celebrating. And my guess is that many of you will have a local church leader who meets these criteria. And if they do, just make sure that you let them know that you're so grateful that they're living the kind of life that generates ministry that is life-giving and glorifying to God and honoring to the people under their care. This is in Paul's letter to Titus. I'm going to read verses 5 through 9 of chapter 1. The reason that I left you in Crete was so that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders or overseers in every town as I directed you. So pause for a moment. Back in the first century, local churches often likely met in homes, and they were led by overseers. So both Paul and Timothy and Titus would have been kind of like circuit preachers. They would visit a bunch of different congregations in a larger geographic area, but the week-to-week oversight of those congregations would have been left to an elder. Sometimes they're called an overseer, other times they're called an under shepherd. And he continues, an elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, one who's self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. There's an interesting line in there that says he must be blameless, and then it gives a list of qualifiers, and I just want to spend some time leaning into those. According to Paul, what does it look like for a spiritual leader to be blameless? And I love it. His first one is to not be overbearing, to be gentle, to be kind, to be the kind of spiritual leader who comes alongside somebody and doesn't lord over them. Again, we're living in a unique cultural moment where strong leadership can often be portrayed as being tyrannical or being domineering. But the Apostle Paul says that's not what we're looking for in a pastor. We're looking for somebody who is not overbearing. Then he says somebody who is not quick-tempered. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that in today's highly charged and divisive climate, it is not easy to be slow to anger. And I have failed here. I remember once about 12 years ago when I got into an online debate with a congregant about a very controversial issue. Now, this is an issue that I had studied extensively at an academic level for years and years and years and years. And I knew I had wrestled with this at a deeper and more thorough level than the person who is coming at me. And all I had to say was, let's sit down and have a conversation about this. But I didn't. Online, I was arrogant and I was overbearing, and I had to apologize. I had to apologize publicly in that forum to that person and anybody else who was watching, because I had been quick-tempered. I had missed the mark. And that's not the kind of person that Paul is looking for to lead a congregation. It's certainly not the kind of person that I want to be. Then he says, not given to drunkenness. Like, there was a big debate in the early years of my ministry, since I grew up in both Baptist and holiness traditions, which kind of the more conservative corners of those are people who would proclaim abstinence when it comes to alcohol. So there were always these debates about whether or not pastors could or couldn't drink. And Paul doesn't say that they can't. He's just really clear. He says that they shouldn't get drunk. And one of the guiding verses over the course of my life in ministry has been in Proverbs 31, verses 4 and 5, where the writer of Proverbs is saying, "It is not for kings, Lemuel. It's not for kings to drink wine. It's not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and deprive all the oppressed of their rights." So he's saying, hey, in order to be a great leader, you have to be clear of mind. And we just don't want any level of inebriation to pollute or contaminate that. He also says that they should be not violent. Now, this seems like a no-brainer. But remember, violence can take different forms. I know of pastors who would never lift a finger to physically harm another person, but have conducted their lives and ministries in such a way that they have caused real spiritual and emotional harm to people on their staff teams and congregants in their pews. So violence doesn't have to be physical for it to be damaging. It can be psychological, it can be manipulative, it can be emotional, and it can be spiritual as well. And Paul gives no quarter to spiritual leaders who express those kind of qualities. And then he says, not pursuing dishonest gain. And if you've been around people who are in ministry, especially people whose ministries might be growing quickly, there is always a temptation to use power or spiritual gifts for influence or for money, even if that's not what God wants in that instance. We see two examples in Scripture about how God speaks out against this unequivocally. In 2 Kings chapter 5, we have the story where Naaman, who was a general from a country that did not believe in the one true God of Israel, who came to Elisha, who is a prophet, the man of God, for healing. And Elisha walks him through a journey where he is healed of his leprosy, and then Naaman offers him a really large sum of money for his healing, and Elisha sends him away. He goes, "That's not... Let the healing be the gift. Tell other people of God's goodness. I don't need a dime. This is something that I would gladly do for free." And as Naaman was traveling home, we read in 2 Kings 5, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi hurried after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running towards him, he got down from the chariot to meet him. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is all right," Gehazi answered. "My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." Again, this is a ruse. This is a lie. Gehazi is not asking for these for any legitimate purpose. He just wants them for himself. So Naaman complies with his request. Gehazi takes them back to his place, and he hides them in his dwelling. And Elisha says to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you?" And they ask this great question, "Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes or olive groves or vineyards or flocks or herds or servants?" It's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Elisha's saying, Gehazi, you should know better. In God, we have access to all of the riches that this world has to offer, but that's not why we do this. We do this out of compassion. We do this out of duty. We do this out of faithfulness, surrender, and devotion to our call. We read later in 1 Samuel chapter 2 about Eli, who is the priest who ended up mentoring young Samuel into the most famous prophet in Israel's history, maybe outside of Moses. But we read this in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Eli has 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were serving as the priests at Shiloh, which would have been the house of God at that time. And verse 12 says, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now, it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, they offered an animal of sacrifice, the priest's servants would come and take a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. And whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. So that was the priest's cut. The priest got a kind of like a temple tax off of the offering that the people had. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest servant would come and say to the person who is sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." So Hophni and Phinehas were trying to break the priestly code for their own convenience, comfort, and desires. And if the person said to him, let the fat be burned first, that's part of my offering to God, and then take whatever you want, the servant would answer, no, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force. And it says, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. And in both instances, the instance of Gehazi and Hophni and Phinehas, greed and the lust for power ultimately disqualified them from ministry. So again, the Apostle Paul says, make sure that you have somebody who isn't given over to dishonest gain. Look for somebody who is hospitable. Somebody who's creating a space, not just with their home or with their church, but with their life that invites other people in. Look for somebody who loves what is good. Look for somebody who bears self-control as a fruit of the Spirit. Look for somebody who's holy, who's focused, who's disciplined. Look for somebody who encourages one another with the truth. Now, whenever I had the opportunity of preaching in a local church, this was fun. This was the exciting and the energizing part of opening up the scriptures, is encouraging people with the truth. But then the next line is this: refute, challenge, correct people who oppose the truth. I'll be the first to say, this is not fun. This is the hard part of pastoral ministry, is calling out heresy, calling out error, calling out rebellion when it's obvious and discernible to everybody who is watching. These are the characteristics, these are the qualities that God is looking for in people who can oversee local expressions of the people of God with honor and candor and kindness. So if you haven't already, let your pastor know how much you appreciate her or him, not because of what they do, but simply because of who they are. It's a tough road that they walk. It is a challenging grind that they step into week after week. And they hear a lot of pushback, and they hear more than their fair share of complaints, but they don't often hear enough what they're doing right and what good you see God doing in them and through them. So if you haven't done it yet, you've still got time. And P.S., you don't only have to do it in October. Any day of the year works just fine. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, and families stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.